Good day, ma'am. My name is Christian Labastida and I'm going to report my PowerPoint presentation. Lesson 2. The History, Philosophy, and Objectives of Imprisonment and the Development of Prisons. Sing Sing Prisons, Auburn System, Pennsylvania System, 5 Deployment of Prisoners, Forms of Punishment, Age of Enlightenment, Personalities Behind Correctional Institutions, Cesar Marquez of Vicaria Buenisaya, Cesar Lombroso, William the Conqueror, Enrico Ferri, and Clifford Shaw. So, the history, philosophy, and objectives of imprisonment and the development of prisons. So, history of imprisonment. So, in the 19th century, prisons were built for the sole purpose of housing inmates. So, they were intended to deter people from committing crimes. So, people who found guilty of crimes would be sent to these penitentiaries and stripped off their freedoms. So, inmates were forced to do hard labor while they were incarcerated and to live in very harsh conditions. So, before long, one of the goals of a prison sentence became the rehabilitation of inmates. So, many people felt that the fear of being locked up would be enough to deter an inmate from ever committing another crime. But other theories held that policies should be introduced to help reform prisoners before they were set free. So these policies include mental examinations, educational programs, and sometimes even far more drastic measures such as electroshock therapy. An opposing viewpoint to the rehabilitative effects of imprisonment claims that being incarcerated will actually cause people to become even more involved with the life of crime, because they become so enveloped in a criminal society while living with other inmates. Regardless of these conflicting opinions on rehabilitation of criminals, imprisonment continues to be one of the most common forms of punishment around the world. So, methods of punishment. So, the target of punishment is one's positions, one's body, or one's psyche. So, punishments throughout the ages have attacked the body. So, corporal punishment, its meaning is to the body, included drawing and quartering, flying, whipping, beheading, dismembering, and numerous other means of torture or death. Fines and disposition of property also have been common throughout the history. So, Conley 1992 writes that fines were more common than physical torture during many time periods. So, execution was an economic as well as a corporal punishment because the person's estate was forfeited to the monarch. So, economic and physical sanctions gradually have given way to imprisonment or lesser deprivations of liberty, or probation or parole. We have reached the point today, at least in this country, where punishment is almost synonymous with imprisonment. So, as early as the end of the 14th century, the imprisonment changed from custody until physical punishment was inflicted to custody as punishment itself. So an increasing number of laws emerge with precisely defined prison sentences. The church also used imprisonment as a punishment for clerics. Gradually, imprisonment for crime became almost indistinguishable from the other institutions that developed for vagrants and idlers, the bridewells, workhouses, and gaols. So all were responses to the same class of citizens. They held the itinerant poor, individuals who often were forced into petty crime because of their poverty. So, philosophy of imprisonment. So, of all the punishments described from the methods of punishment, prison is perhaps the most complex. It affects the prisoner's possession because they can earn little or no income while incarcerated. They may lose their job, their livelihood, and their life savings, their lifetime earning capacity affected. So it affects the body also because he or she is under the control of others. And they have a little freedom. Imprisonment may result in actual physical harm, attacks by correctional officers or other inmates, or from illness or injuries that left untreated. So prison also attacks the psyche by attempts at reformation and through the mental deterioration that occurs because of the negative environment of the prison. So many describe prison as a psychological punishment. According to some, prison is in its more severe form attacks the soul. It attacks on the heart, the thoughts, the will, the inclinations of the prisoner. So prison critics allege that the most detrimental effects are not physical deterioration but mental and moral deterioration. So you are nothing, like it's a theme that prison inmates live with during the course of their imprisonment. And the mental toll that prison takes on its population is very difficult to measure. So the purpose of imprisonment. So there are a number of accepted reasons for the use of imprisonment. 1. Approach aims to deter those who would otherwise commit crimes, or general deterrence, and to make it less likely that those who serve a prison sentence will commit crimes after their release. Individual deterrence. A second approach focuses on issuing punishment to or obtaining retribution from those who have committed serious crimes. So a third approach encourages the personal reform of those who are sent to prison. Finally, in some cases, it is necessary to protect the public from those who commit crimes, particularly from those who do so persistently. In individual cases, all or some of these justifications may apply. The increasing importance of the notion of reform has led some prison systems to be called correctional institutions. So, Sing Sing prisons. So, Sing Sing in Fall Sing Sing Correctional Facility, maximum security prison located in Ossining, New York. In use since 1826, it is one of the oldest penal institutions in the United States. It is also among the most well-known in the country, especially notable for its harsh conditions in the 19th and 20th centuries. So, overview. So, Sing Sing Correctional Facility is a maximum security level facility for males. So, the criminal in the Sing Sing prisons are all males. Why is prison called Sing Sing? So, Sing Sing's name comes from the Indian phrase, Sen Sink. It means stone on stone. In 1901, 3 years after Edison introduced the electric chair at Sing Sing, the town changed its name to Ossining so people wouldn't confuse it with the jail. So, is Sing Sing a rough prison? Sing Sing is a maximum security prison in Ossining, New York, operated by the New York State Department of Corrections. So, the prison currently houses around 1,300 inmates and has notoriously been one of America's most ruthless prisons. So, yes, it is a rough prison. Pennsylvania system. So, the Pennsylvania system was an early prison system requiring inmate silence, individual cells, and inmate labor in those cells. So, this is where the Eastern Penitentiary came from, which is a prison facility designed on the Pennsylvania system with rows of individual cells attached to corridors and outside cells. So, outside cells. Prison cells attached to a corridor with the back of the cell extending outward toward a peripheral wall. This prison was built like a square wheel with the cell blocks arranged like spokes around the hub, or central rotunda. The routine at Eastern was solitary confinement, silence, and labor in outside cells. So, prison's history, the Pennsylvania system. So, unlike Auburn or Sing Sing, Pennsylvania's Eastern Penitentiary was intended to keep convicts separate even as they worked. in order to prevent any earthly contamination or destruction that might impede their repentance. Hence the term penitentiary. So it was located on Cherry Hill on the outskirts of Philadelphia, Eastern, represented one of the most imposing and expensive architectural achievements in the United States to date, and it contained innovations such as running water and flush toilets in all the cells. Although Beaumont and Tocqueville found it incontestable that this perfect isolation secures the prisoner from all fatal contamination, they favored the most effective, more cost-effective Auburn plan, which seemed more likely to enable states to profit from convict labor. Francis Lieber, the Prussian immigrant scholar who translated Beaumont and Tocqueville's work into English, hailed America's new penitentiary system as monuments of a charitable disposition of the honest members of society toward their fallen and unfortunate brethren. So Labor coined the term penology to describe that branch of criminal science which occupies itself with the punishment of the criminal, not with the definition of crime, the subject of accountability, and the proving of the crime which belongs to criminal law and the penal process. So another prominent foreign visitor to Eastern Penitentiary was more critical of the uncompromising solitary confinement approach. So after touring the institution in 1842, Charles Dickens, the English novelist, concluded in his American notes that the Pennsylvania plan was cruel and wrong. So he found out thus that this slow and daily tampering with the mysteries of the brain to be immeasurably worse than any torture of the body. So, Auburn system. So, the Auburn system, also known as the New York system and congregate system, is a penal method of the 19th century in which persons worked during the day in groups and were kept in solitary confinement at night, with enforced silence at all times. So the Auburn system was a model consisting of small individual cells, large work area for group labor, and enforced silence. So it was opened in 1819. So the prison administrators developed a system that was almost the opposite of that used at the Eastern Penitentiary. So, inside cells, prison cells that do not touch the outside walls of the cell block. So unfortunate, byproduct of the badly planned Auburn experiment was the use of solitary confinement as a means of punishment within the prison. So the regimen at Auburn also included congregate work in the shops during the day, separation of prisoners into small individual cells at night, silence at all times, lockstep marching formation, and a congregate meal at which the prisoners sat face to back. There was great emphasis on silence. So in the belief that verbal exchange between prisoners was contaminating, conversation was prevented by liberal use of the whip. So they are not allowed to talk. So Auburn's structural design with inside cells and wings composed of 2 to 4 tiers of cells or cell blocks became the model for most prisons built in the following 150 years. So cell blocks, it is the multi-tier living cells usually stacked one atop the other, built within a hollow building and not touching exterior walls. So prison history, the Auburn plan. So the establishment of a second New York State prison at Auburn in 1816 soon led to a new prison model and regime, designed to keep convicts separate and unable to communicate with each other, even as they were forced to labor as penal slaves. So they were not allowed to talk, and they were forced to labor as penal slaves. So industry, obedience, and silence was the guiding principles of the new system. So its chief proponents and rulers was Elam Lanes. So he served for many years as warden of Auburn and other prisons. By the early 1820s, the Auburn plan had resulted in the construction of tiny individual cells and workshops as well as a rigid system of enforced silence and harsh punishments. Each entering convict was assigned a prison number, which served as his or her identity. Movement to and from the workshops was performed in a regimented manner, known as the lockstep, which called for prisoners to march in military-style human chain. So a Boston clergyman who visited Auburn in 1826 found it a shining example of what could be accomplished with the proper discipline and design. So the whole establishment from the gate to the sewer is a specimen of neatness, he wrote. So the unlimited industry, the entire subordination, and subdued feelings of the convicts have probably no parallel among an equal number of criminals. So Reverend Louis Dwight and his associates from the Boston Prison Discipline Society pronounced Auburn a noble institution and said, "We regard it as a model worthy of the world's imitation." So the institution seemed so successful that in 1825, Lynch was assigned to build a similar prison in Sing Sing. So many Americans took such pride in what they seemed to have accomplished in their new model prisons that they encouraged visitors to tour the institutions in exchange for a small fee to see for themselves what was being done with public funds. So in 1831, there are two young French magistrates, Gustave de Beaumont and Alexis de Tocqueville. So they were dispatched by their government to study the new American prison systems and report back on their application in France. So Tocqueville was interested in observing America's political system, which later would form the basis of his classical study, Democracy in America. So he visited the United States in order to examine different penal approaches. So the two wrote in on the penitentiary system in the United States and its application in France that the society in the United States gives the example of the most extended liberty. So the prisons of the same country offer the spectacle of the most complete despotism. So prison competition. So supporters of the Pennsylvania system claimed it was easier to control the prisoners, give more consideration to their individual needs, prevented contamination by the complete separation of prisoners from one another, and provided more opportunity for meditation and penitence. So the overnight or congregate system was cheaper. So it's construct and get started. So offered better vocational training and produced more money for the state. So in the end, the congregate system was adopted in almost all other American prisons. Difference between Auburn and Pennsylvania systems. So the Auburn system was criticized for its being too harsh on punishment and lack of having rehabilitative potential. So the Pennsylvania system was criticized for its being too costly due to their focus on solitary confinement. So forms of punishment. Throughout history, society has developed different ways to simultaneously punish criminal offenders while also ensuring the safety of the public. Those who study types of crimes and their punishments learn that 5 major types of criminal punishment have emerged: incapacitation, deterrence, retribution, rehabilitation, and restoration. So, incapacitation. So, the theory of incapacitation assumes that the state has a duty to protect the public from future wrongs or harms, and that such protection can be afforded through some form of incarceration or incapacitation. It prevents future crime by disabling or restricting the offender's liberty, their movements, or ability to commit a further wrong. So, the most extreme form of incapacitating punishment is the death penalty. So, there are several other forms including imprisonment, curfews, house arrest, electronic monitoring, and disqualification from driving for drunken drivers. So, incapacitating sentencing, however, has been subject to serious criticism on both moral and empirical grounds. So, one major concern is that incapacitating sentences effectively punish individuals for crimes not yet committed. So, an inherent risk with incapacitation is that some individuals who have committed a crime and are thus incarcerated or incapacitated would not have gone on to reoffend. So, Barton suggests even if the methods of predictions were accurate, there are naturally moral and ethical questions about incarcerating individuals for what they may do rather than what they have actually done. So yet, this justification for punishment has proved highly popular among politicians and the media, and has clearly played a role in significant rises in prison populations across many jurisdictions. So, deterrence. So, deterrence aims to prevent future crime and can focus on specific general deterrence. So specific deterrence deals with making an individual less likely to commit a future crime because of fear of getting a similar or worse punishment. So general deterrence refers to the impact on members of the public who became less likely to commit a crime after learning of the punishment another person experienced. So, Smith and Liu explained the four types of deterrence are generally recognized. So, there are four types of deterrence. The specific deterrence, general deterrence, marginal deterrence, and the partial deterrence. So, the special deterrence analyzes how effective punishment is on an individual's future behavior. 2. General deterrence seeks to understand how individual punishment can deter others from committing crimes. So 3. Marginal deterrence seeks to reconcile how effective different types of punishment are as either specific or general deterrence. 4. Partial deterrence refers to situations in which the threat of penalty has some deterrent value, even when someone engages in illegal behavior. For example, a criminal simply robbing a victim instead of also causing physical harm. So, retribution. So, is probably the oldest justification of punishment and can be found in the theories offered by Kant and Hegel. So, it is the fact that the individual has committed a wrongful act that justifies punishment, and what the punishment should be proportional to the wrong committed. So, its underlying premise has been summarized by the philosopher Kurt Bayer as follows. 1. All those convicted of a wrongdoing or crime deserve punishment. 2. Only those convicted of a wrongdoing or crime deserve punishment. 3. The severity of the punishment should not be less than the gravity of the crime. 4. The severity of the punishment should not be greater than the gravity of the crime. Rehabilitation. So the central premise of rehabilitation is that punishment can prevent future crime by reforming the individual offender's behavior. So it may involve education and vocational programs, counseling, intervention programs, or skills training. So this theory of punishment is that criminal behavior is not a rational choice, but determined by social pressures, psychological difficulties, or situational problems of various kinds. Although once dominant in penal discourse, the ideal of reform became discredited in the early 1970s, partly due to research results which suggested that penal measures intended to reform offenders were no more effective than punitive measures in preventing recidivism. So, furthermore, rehabilitative approaches have been criticized for holding an overly deterministic view of behavior that places too much emphasis on social and cultural conditions, and too little on the ability of individuals to make decisions and choices. So it also conflicts with the idea of a right not to be punished disproportionately and places no limits on the extent of treatment or intervention. So yet reform remains a key rationale within many penal systems, justifying punishment which aims to address and reduce the risk and needs of individual offenders. So this new approach to criminal justice calls for the offender to make direct amends to the victim of their crime, as well as the community where the crime occurred. Judges use this approach mostly with juvenile offenders. In this approach, the criminal and the victim meet so that the offender can hear what the victim says about their experience with the crime committed. The offender then strives to make amends and seek forgiveness. Age of Enlightenment. What was the Enlightenment? So the Age of Enlightenment was a philosophic movement of the 18th century marked by a rejection of traditional, social, religious, and political ideas and an emphasis on rationalism. So the events of the 18th century are especially important to the student of corrections, for it was during the period, later known as the Age of Enlightenment, that some of the most brilliant philosophers of our history recognized humanity's essential dignity and imperfection and lead the movement for reform. So the Enlightenment period in history of Western thought and culture stretches roughly from the mid-decades of the 17th century through the 18th century. So it was characterized by the dramatic revolutions in science, philosophy, society, and politics. So these revolutions swept away the dark medieval world view and ushered in the light that is thought to typify our modern Western world. So Enlightenment thought culminates historically in the political upheaval of the French Revolution, in which the traditional hierarchical political and social orders, French monarchy, the privileges of the French nobility, the political power and the authority of the Catholic Church, were violently destroyed and replaced by a political and social order informed by the Enlightenment ideals of freedom and equality for all founded ostensibly upon principles of human reason. So the Enlightenment begins with the scientific revolution of the 16th and 17th centuries, the rise of the new science. So progressively worked to undermine not only the ancient geocentric conception of the cosmos, and with it the entire set of presuppositions that serve to constrain as well as guide philosophical inquiry. So who are the great thinkers of the Enlightenment? So the Enlightenment is associated with the French thinkers of the mid-decades of the 18th century, so-called philosophies: Voltaire, Diderot, D'Alembert, Montesquieu, etc. So the philosophies constitute an informal society of men of letters who collaborate on a loosely defined project of enlightenment centered around the project of the encyclopedia. So the Enlightenment has broader boundaries, geographical and temporal, than this suggests. So other thinkers who turned out to be influential in shaping the early study of crime and criminals included John Locke, Thomas Hobbes, and Jeremy Bentham. So John Locke, for example, was concerned with the relationship between civil society, human behavior, and punishment. He theorized that when humans live in a pre-societal state of nature, they had no formal constraints on their behavior. So Thomas Hobbes was also concerned about this relationship in the case of Hobbes. He believed that life in the state of nature was the one where individuals constantly faced danger and peril, that humans were always on the brink of war of all against all. The only potential restraint on human behavior was government, or what Hobbes referred to as the Leviathan. So in his view, people needed to give up their claim to unrestrained freedom in order to live in a civil society. Striking the proper balance between freedom and restraint on freedom was essential to the social contract. So Jeremy Bentham is important for being one of the founders of modern utilitarianism. So the main current of philosophical ethics since the late 18th century for his defense of psychological and ethical hedonism. So, and for his far-reaching proposals for the reform of parliament, the legal code, the judiciary, and the prison. Personalities behind correctional institution. Cesar Beccaria. So, he was one of the greatest minds of the Age of Enlightenment in the 18th century. So, his writings is about criminology and economics were well ahead of their time. So, early life. So, he was born on March 15, 1738 in Milan, Italy. So, his father was an aristocrat and born on Austrian Habsburg Empire. So, Beccaria received his primary education at the Jesuit school in Parma, Italy. So, he described his early education as fanatical and oppressive of the development of human feelings. So, despite his frustration at school, he was an excellent math student following his education at the Jesuit school. So, he attended the University of Pavia, where he received a law degree in 1758. So, he was a criminologist and economist. So, in early 1760, he helped form a society called the Academy of Fists. So, it dedicated the economic, political, and administrative reform. So, in 1764, he published his famous and influential criminology essay on crimes and punishments. So, in 1768, he started a career in economics which lasted until his death. So, his influential treatise on crimes and punishments is considered a foundational work in the field of criminology. So there are three major themes of the Enlightenment run through the treatise. The idea that the social contract forms the moral and political basis of the work's reformist zeal. The idea that science supports a dispassionate and reasoned appeal for reforms, and the belief that progress is inextricably bound to science. So all these three provide the foundation for accepting Beccaria's proposals. Next is Marquis of Beccaria Buonasera. So he is an Italian philosopher and politician, and best known also for his own crimes and punishment. So which condemned torture and the death penalty, and was a founding work in the field of criminology. So next is Cesar Lombroso. So he was also an Italian criminologist, phrenologist, physician, and founder of the Italian school of positivist criminology. So Lombroso rejected the established classical school, which held that crime was a characteristic trait of human nature. So early life of Cesar Lombroso. So he was born in Verona on November 6, 1835. So he studied medicine at the universities of Pavia, Padua, Vienna, and Genoa. So he has interest in psychology, psychiatry. So his study of the physiology and anatomy of the brain, and ultimately lead to his anthropometric analysis of criminals. So while he was in charge of the insane at hospitals in Pavia, Pesaro, and Reggio Emilia in 1863 to 1872, so he has interest in physiognomical characteristics of the mentally disturbed increased. So he also described as the father of modern criminology. So his theory is of the born criminal, dominated thinking about criminal behavior in the late 19th and early 20th century. So he believed essentially that criminality was inherited, and that criminals could be identified by physical attributes such as hawk-like noses and bloodshot eyes. So he was one of the first people in history to use scientific methods to study crime. So William the Conqueror. So the policies of William the Conqueror, he was a king of England from 1066 until his death in 1087. So he was largely responsible for eventually making Britain the most powerful nation in Europe. So, when at the age of 8, he became Duke of Normandy and later King of England. Violence plagued his early reign, so with the help of King Henry I of France, William managed to survive the early years. So after the Battle of Hastings in 1066, he was crowned King of England. So he never knew how to speak English and was illiterate, but he had more influence on the evolution of the English language than anyone before or since. So William the Conqueror ruled England until his death on September 9, 1087 in Rouen, France. So early life. So he was born on circa 1028 in Falaise, Normandy, France. So he was an illegitimate child of Robert I, a Duke of Normandy, who died in 1035 while returning from a pilgrimage to Jerusalem. So at only 8 years of age, William became the new Duke of Normandy. Violence and corruption plagued his early reign. So as the feudal barons fought for control of this fragile dukedom, a few of William's guards died and his teacher was murdered during a period of severe anarchy. So with the help of King Henry I of France, William managed to survive the early years. So Enrico Ferri. So he was an Italian criminologist, socialist, and student of Cesare Lombroso. He was also the founder of the Italian School of Criminology. So while Lombroso researched on purported physiological factors that motivated criminals, Ferri investigated social and economic aspects. Enrico Ferri served as editor of the socialist daily Avante, and in 1884 he saw his book Criminal Sociology published. So later, he served as basis for Argentina's Penal Code of 1921. Although he was rejected by the Italian dictator Benito Mussolini, Ferri became one of Mussolini and his National Fascist Party's main external supporters. So early life. So he was born in Lombardy in 1856. He worked first as a lecturer and later as a professor of criminal law. So he spent his time as a student of Cesare Lombroso. So while Lombroso researched anthropological criminology, he focused more on social and economic influences on the criminal and crime rates. Clifford Shaw. So he was an American sociologist and criminologist. So he was a major figure in the Chicago School of Sociology during the 1930s and 40s. So he was considered one of the most influential figures in American criminology. So he worked also on juvenile delinquency with Henry D. McKay. They conducted it in the late 1920s, and they played a pivotal role in moving the study of such delinquency toward the discipline of sociology and away from psychology and psychiatry. So here are the Shaw and McKay's work span and the three general areas. 1. Studying geographic variation in rates of juvenile delinquency. 2. The study of autobiographical works by delinquents. 3. And the development of the Chicago Area Project, a delinquency prevention program in the Chicago area. So, the two studies published by Shaw and McKay in the 1930s and 40s. So, they were still in high regard among social scientists in the 1970s. So, how they are involved in the development of correctional institutions. Cesar Beccaria. He is well remembered for his treatise on crimes and punishments on 1764, which condemned about torture and the death penalty. And also he was a founding work in the field of penology and the classical school of criminology. And also he is considered as the father of modern criminal law and criminal justice. Cesare Lombroso. So Lombroso tried to reform the Italian penal system and he encouraged more humane and constructive treatment of convicts through the use of work programs intended to make them more productive members of our society. William the Conqueror. So before he became the King of England, he was one of the mightiest nobles in France. So as the Duke of Normandy, he is best remembered for leading the Norman conquest of England in 1066, which changed the course of English history and earned him the sobriquet William the Conqueror. Enrico Ferri. So he is a founder of the Positivist school and he researched psychological and social positivism as opposed to the biological positivism of Lombroso. Clifford Shaw. So Clifford Shaw and Henry Mackay have a theory. It is called cultural deviance theory. So cultural deviance theory suggests that conformity to the prevailing cultural norms of lower class society causes crimes. So the researchers are Clifford Shaw and Henry Mackay. So they studied crime patterns in Chicago in the early 1900s. So they found that violence and crime were at their worst in the middle of the city and gradually decreased the farther someone traveled from the urban center toward the suburbs. So they also noticed that this pattern matched the migration patterns of Chicago citizens. New immigrants, many of them poor and lacking knowledge of the English language, live in neighborhoods inside the city. So as the population expanded, wealthier people moved to the suburbs and left behind the less privileged. So they concluded that socioeconomic status correlated to race and ethnicity resulted in a higher crime rate. So the mix of cultures and values created a smaller society with different ideas of deviance, and those values and ideas were transferred from generation to generation. So the theory of Sean Mackay has been further tested and expounded upon by Robert Sampson and Byron Groves. So they found out that poverty, ethnic diversity, and family disruption is given localities had a strong positive correlation with social disorganization. So they also determined that social disorganization was associated with the high rates of crime and delinquency. So the recent studies from Samson that conducted by Lydia Bean revealed similar findings. High rates of poverty and single-parent homes correlated with high rates of juvenile violence. That's all, thank you. In my life.